Generally, whenever you're using Boxcutter, you will click and drag on the surface to begin your cut, and then after releasing the left mouse button, you'll begin performing the extrusion process. Then from there, clicking will complete the operation. Of course, you can just click and drag and click once in order to perform a laser cut, just auto bypassing the entire extrude operation, but that's the general use of Boxcutter. Whenever you're using a box, you're just drawing your cuts and then of course pressing B maybe to bevel, press T to give it some solidification and things like that. But generally you draw, you perform the extrusion, and then you click to complete, and that's the normal way that you would use Boxcutter. However, we've had something called Autodepth that we attempted to add a few releases back. If we go on our behavior panel and expand shape, we see that Autodepth now has its own parameter. So if we enable it, we now see that whenever we begin clicking and dragging, that the depth is automatically being calculated based off of the longest edge. If you want to flip it, of course there's an option for that, but this is basically a quick overview of what you can expect whenever it comes to using Autodepth inside of Boxcutter. So nothing much has changed about it from the last release, but there has been a lot that has been expanded to it to make it a lot more functional in this current day and age whenever it comes to using Autodepth in your general workflow. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it more in depth. So while in Autodepth, we can of course left click and right click at the same time in order to pause it and adjust the extrusion ourselves manually to get something a little bit more adjusted to our needs, and of course click to complete. Previously, join didn't work properly, so if you were performing a Autodepth cut and you press J, it would actually continue in the same direction. Now we see that it actually inverts the opposite direction, which is something that was kind of a long time bug that was going on whenever it came to Autodepth. In fact, if we open up the previous version of Boxcutter, we can perform a cut using Autodepth, and then if we press J, we see that it doesn't actually flip it the way it's supposed to, so I'm happy to announce that this has been resolved. Another thing that was improved with Autodepth is the ability to use static wedge with Autodepth. So now if you say draw a box and you press W to convert it to wedge, you can press W to make it a wedge again. And we see that as we draw the box, the wedge no longer does any sort of edge calculation, edge fandangling adjustments, which was something that became a bit of an irritation with the previous iteration of wedge. So one of the goals of static wedge is to make wedge a lot more predictable than it was previously, increasing its usability and making it a lot more flexible for all users. In fact, if we bring up the previous version where we have Autodepth enable, if we press W to activate wedge, we see that as we bring it in closer, despite being inside of Autodepth, we're still adjusting the angle of the wedge, which is something that just got annoying whenever it came to making very small wedges, and something that we just didn't want happening inside of Boxcutter. So I'm happy to announce that that has been resolved as well. So here we are in the previous version of Boxcutter, utilizing Autodepth under the previous area, and if we just jump over to custom cutter, we see that whenever we draw a custom cut, that it works with the same rules that it does with box. However, if we press shift, we can actually activate a custom cutter one-to-one mode with Autodepth, and for a tool that's dedicated to removing keystrokes, having the additional keystroke of shift being a trigger in order to draw shapes one-to-one, especially with shift being a shift to live centric tool as well, us having users hold shift in order to draw shapes one-to-one with custom cutter and Autodepth just seemed like a little bit of a reach. So this is something that we also sought to change. So if we minimize this blender and we go back, we see that we're already on custom. And if we go under our Autodepth, we see that there's an option here for custom proportions, where when enabled, that means that whenever you draw a cutter, it will automatically have the proper proportions every time without you having to hold shift. In fact, it reverses the behavior. It makes it where you have to hold shift in order to draw it in a free fashion. As shown in the previous examples, Boxcutter works just fine in the previous versions when it comes to using it with cut. However, it did come into some stumbles whenever it comes to knife. So if we click the quick switch for knife, we see that while I'm able to draw these knives on the surface, we're not seeing any implied detail of the line boxes being cut into it, leaving their edge imprint. So this was something that was a bit of a problem, but something that I'm also happy to announce that we were able to resolve with this latest version. So if we go under our behavior sprocket under shape and enable Autodepth, we can of course begin cutting with Autodepth just like I was showing previously. However, if we turn on knife, we're also able to begin cutting using knife into the surface, and we see that it now works as intended. So I'm glad to see that this bug has finally been taken care of. So we've talked about how whenever you draw a cut using Autodepth, it automatically is calculated by one of the longest edges to give you the depth. However, this is able to be reversed in the settings, but what if you actually wanted to override the settings for what determines the amount of depth that's being given to the object? Because while Autodepth is pretty cool, it is rather limited without any sort of global control to limit or increase the amount of cut that's occurring. So this is something we also sought to resolve in this particular update. So last but not least is the Autodepth multiplier. If we go in and we click on this, we're able to change it to any number we want, but right now it's set to 1, which means that it's set to a depth of 1. To show this in action, we'll just draw a cut and press J in order to make it join, and we see that we get a rather tall join because of the size that we created. But what if we wanted to create a series of small joins around this that were inside of a particular range that weren't going so far off of the surface? Well, that's where the depth multiplier will come in. So if we just set this to something like 0.2, we can just select this and begin drawing our cut, press J, and we see that things are now being limited down to 0.2 of what it formerly was, which allows us to get a much more controlled result. So there's just a lot of ways that you're able to work with Autodepth compared to before in a way that I consider enough to be an expansion. Of course, right now I'm pressing J every cut in order to jump over. I could also press Control D and go in my behavior helper and change it over to join, which the behavior panel will be the next thing changing in a future update. So let's just draw our shape out and bring this up and click, and we're able to just begin drawing these shapes, just overriding the depth. And it also goes the other way. What if we want to set this to something like 10, just something astronomical? Well, now whenever we draw, we're getting very large, tall structures because we're now multiplying the auto depth by 10 instead of 0.2, which is what I was demonstrating previously. Of course, keep in mind you could always press tab in order to pause it in the middle of your draw, or left click and right click at the same time, which is, I don't know, I guess a little bug of sorts that I've just gotten used to for just overriding things with just a mouse. It is nice to be able to pause things without even having to press something on the keyboard. But notice at the moment that I begin grabbing the draw dot, it automatically begins adjusting the depth because the auto depth is being overridden by the parameters that are set in the auto depth panel. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're messing around with auto depth. And of course, we can always just right click this to set it back to defaults, but it doesn't appear that we're able to do that inside of our custom system. So we'll just set that back to 1, and now we're cutting with the auto depth of 1, just making all these joins on the surface. In fact, we could press Control D and switch back over to cut and perform cuts in this, knowing that they're going to be precisely the amount of depth that's being specified in the panel above. So right here I'm using Blender 2.83.15, and if I begin clicking and dragging and creating a shape, we can begin the extrusion. I'm just going to press B to bevel it, and we'll press J to create a join, and let's just shift it to live, and we see that the cut didn't completely work out. And if we select the main shape and we look at the boolean, we see that we don't actually have any options for changing the solver, and that's because we're using an older version of Blender. So that means in order to make this cut work, we have to select the shape and possibly move it up a little bit. And really, whenever it comes to older versions of Blender, this is just a way of life, so don't feel bad. Normally at this point, I would just hide the shape, look at it from side view, make sure I'm in box, and just draw a cut and just cut it off from the top, and it's able to work out. However, in later versions of Blender, like 2.93 and above, you're able to utilize something called a solver. And so if you go inside Boxcutter, underneath behavior, there's an option for a Boolean solver where you can choose between exact and fast. Fast is the default that you saw fell previously, and exact is a bit slower. However, it can sometimes work in situations where fast cannot. In fact, they're kind of interchangeable in some situations. So we've added the ability for users to be able to swap between them on the fly. So I'm just going to draw the same cut as before. We'll press B in order to bevel it. We'll press J to convert it to a join, and we see that the cut actually worked out. So let's just shift it to live, press H, and let's just take a look at our shape. And it worked out because we're in exact. We're supposed to actually do it in fast so we could see what it's like to fail, and then we would actually change it over to exact and see this cut actually work out. But let's say that we were working inside of fast instead of exact, which is the default way that users should be working, and you ran into this issue. So we'll perform our cut, press B, and then press J, and we see that there's some Z fighting artifacting showing on the surface. If we were to press Alt E, we're able to change the solver from exact to basically fast on the fly. So we see that by changing it, we're able to change the Boolean result before we even apply our cut. Instead of having to go into the behavior panel or the Boolean panel to change these options, you're now able to change it on the fly. So if we click and apply, we see that this cut actually works out. If we go under the hops panel, we can see that it lists all the booleans on the object, and it lets us know that there's an exact boolean and there's another exact boolean, just in case you need to deal with it. In fact, let's just change this over to fast, and we see how it does not work out very fast. And this is a place where I like to go in HardOps just to change booleans real fast, sometimes just to see if they work out in the event that they're having issues. But just letting you know that if you're using Boxcutter and you perform a cut and you run into a Boolean issue, you can now experiment with pressing Alt E in order to change between exact and fast on the fly. I accidentally pressed W there, but by pressing Alt E, you're able to experiment between changing between the different Boolean algorithms.